Hello everyone, welcome back. Today Kibby and I are talking about something that once again we are very excited to talk about, but this time we really extra mean it because we are going to talk about narcissism, which is one of our absolute favorite topics. It is probably the number one thing actually that I would like to research. Kind of difficult to research for a number of reasons, but we are going to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly of narcissism. There may be a couple episodes we do because we love this topic so much. But today we're going to focus on love relationships and narcissism and what it's like to be dating or married to a narcissist, what it is, different kinds of treatments that can help potentially. And I'll tell a personal story of my early 20s, dating a narcissist for 4 years. It was a good time. And we will start out, I guess, by going over what it is. So there are actually two kinds of narcissism. We'll go into that in a second, but generally the big picture is someone who has narcissistic personality disorder, which is a distinct thing, has a really exaggerated sense of self-importance. They have an incredible sense of entitlement. They need a lot of admiration. They need to be recognized as superior even without necessarily deserving that. They tend to exaggerate their own self-importance. They are preoccupied with fantasies of the perfect love, of the perfect success, of the perfect amount of respect that they will one day achieve. They like to be associated with very powerful people. They expect special treatment. And the especially dark side is that they can tend to take advantage of other people. They can be exploitative. And they can be rather low on emotional empathy. They're not necessarily low on cognitive empathy, though, I don't think, because they need to use it to exploit you. So, yeah. So, Kibby, what would you add to that, or how would you maybe distinguish grandiose from vulnerable narcissism?
Yeah, so I think that in general, just to put it out there, a lot of these personality disorders, same as we talked about with borderline personality disorder, a lot of these traits are completely normal, in small doses, right? Everyone has a little bit of narcissism. It's actually quite healthy, to kind of have a high self-esteem or to, recognize your specialness, right? That is actually quite normal. So even just, if you're listening to this and think, oh, that does sound a little bit like me, that's actually
sounds
quite
a lot
normal.
Like me. So that's
right. So don't freak out when you hear these traits. So they're traits, and they're on a spectrum. So some people just have them in certain contexts, like at work, they feel this way, but what we're talking about is when all of these traits are so extreme, they actually get in the way of all domains in their life, all throughout their life, ruins relationships at work and romantic relationships. So the main point too is when people think of narcissistic personality disorder, narcissist, we might think of like the most stereotype, grandiose type, right? Like people who are like super into themselves, super need admiration. You could definitely think of politicians who might fall into that category, but I think some funny, like Zoolander, and if anyone remembers that, Zoolander would be the one example there. Kind of in a way, Michael Scott from The Office, like he has a little histrionic flair. Yeah, but he also has this need to be admired, right? He's constantly looking for, people like me in a way that doesn't really make any sense. And he gets so sad when he gets criticized, right? So there's this kind of flip of like grandiosity of like, I'm amazing. And then the other side is the vulnerability, like the shame, the insecurity, the I'm the worst, I'm nothing. So narcissists will often flip back and forth. That's, some research is showing that. But there's also different subtypes where you might be more like that more of the time. So narcissists can look grandiose, where they're constantly bragging, they're constantly haughty and arrogant, but they can also look very vulnerable. They present as very like shame-based and vulnerable and self-sacrificing, but actually they really want the admiration for that too. So we're going to interview Dr. Diane Diamond, who is one of my supervisors, who is an expert on treating narcissistic personality disorder. She'll talk all about that. So yeah, it could look like this, but basically it's this like really unstable self-esteem. And based on that, and what's driving that unstable self-esteem is this idea that narcissists will tend to feel like there's a huge difference between what they are and what they should be, like this ideal, which is a concept we'll come back to a lot in narcissistic personality disorder. The tendency to idealize themselves and other people. So really what that means is like, it's almost this like, they're kind of hooked on this one-dimensional view of themselves and others, like the perfect relationship. Oh, one day I'm going to find a man who's just like, he was, wealthy, who's caring, will always fulfill my needs, who's always there, right? This kind of like almost fantastical, like fairy tale versions of things. And a lot of psychodynamic theories talk about how that could be because when babies are born and kids are growing up, there is this idealizing relationship between the kid and the parent, right? Like the kids look at their parents like gods, like they can do no wrong. They're these amazing, wonderful people that is like the center of their lives. And vice versa. Like the kid is like this beautiful, perfect child that they love. And eventually, right, when you grow up, you start to have more complex ideas of the kid and the mother and the caregiver. They're human. They have faults. They mess up sometimes. They don't fulfill all the needs you want. And that's kind of integrated like, oh, we're human beings, are this full self, we want them to be gods, but actually they're just like people. But for people who have narcissistic personality disorder, for some reason, maybe through neglect or emotional neglect or some other, or abandonment, abuse or something, some interruption in that normal getting to know you process between a child and caregiver, they just hold on to that fantasy, that ideal version of themselves and their parents. And they think, I can only be loved if I'm this perfect child who achieves and is perfectly beautiful or perfectly behaves and, in this way, and vice versa. I can only love someone who could be like this perfect person who's like the best and special.
This is what I find so sympathetic about narcissism and why it's so important to talk about it as a dimensional construct, with NPD being at the extreme. Narcissism is something that we all have some degree of, and like Kibby said, it can actually be really healthy and necessary. But I find it really sympathetic, this idea that we have this painful gap between who we are and who we think we should be. And I wonder if that, a lot of people theorize that is on the increase in every generation. They call it the narcissistic generation. And I see this with patients, I see this with myself, but especially in love relationships, these idealized forms of love. Love isn't supposed to be hard. It isn't supposed to be boring or practical or toenails and earwax. It's supposed to be, the holiday. I really actually hated that movie, but it's supposed to be, the rom-com, the beautiful love that we see in media. And I wonder sometimes if we become more and more sort of detached from reality with more and more of these images coming in.
I think what you're saying is that we now have, especially in the US, have such a culture projecting a perfect image, right? We have Instagram and things where most people post the glossy parts. So there's a very, very clear view of what we should be, right? And then we live the painful reality of what we are. So there's that huge gap.
We also live in a society that very much emphasizes sort of it pushes the idea that we should always be better than the previous generation, or that we should always be living up to our own potential. And it's this idea of potential, I think in some ways is replacing tradition. But you can see right there, like we feel immense pressure to be what we see on social media, or to be the best versions of ourselves, or to have the most amazing career. And all of these are ideals that we're striving for at all times. I think it can get very easy to get stuck in that trap and to have a lot of unhappiness living in that gap between what we are and what we feel immense pressure and what we've always been told and been sent messages about that we should be, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that from what I'm learning, and Dr. Diamond will talk about this too, but how the dysfunction manifests in the inability to go from the reality to the ideal, right? So we might have dreams. Everyone has dreams of what they want to be, or the kind of person they want to be married to or love. But narcissists have a really hard time, achieving that, like taking the really painful, hard steps to go from like, oh, I'm single, or I just started dating this person, to like getting to know them and moving forward. Or even, when people have big goals and big ambitions, narcissists will just kind of have that hanging in their minds, but they won't work towards them. Most people might say, okay, how do I get there? I'm going to have to take I'm going to get an entry-level job. I'm going to have to work my way up there. But narcissists might have that sense of like, but I'm special and life should just be perfect. So I don't want to, there's something that they feel anxious about those, or like repulsed or disgusted by those like nitty-gritty steps in reality to get to those, grandiose or even achievable goals.
Where do you think the lack of empathy comes from? The kind of dark, very dark side of narcissism, treating other people poorly, the exploitativeness.
So I don't know if there's as much literature on the empathy deficits in narcissism as I think there should be, and I'd love to do that kind of work. From what I understand, the concept that I am a special, idealized person may allow people to feel entitled to not do or pay attention to other things in the same way that other people would. So, for example, if I'm so special and I'm like this amazing person that everyone should just love because I'm like really beautiful and fun and charismatic, I'm not going to really develop my ability to pay attention to other people's feelings, because that's not the source of connection. The source of connection is the admiration that people would have for me. Right. So that's the way I've been thinking about it, where in loving relationships and attachment, if you just have these idealized forms of yourself and the attachment figure, the admiration and the idealization is like the currency for the love. It's not like paying attention to their feelings and being with them in the pain and all the other kind of messier human aspects of connection. It's this, do they see and admire for these like status or or like perfection, signs of perfection? And if not, then that's not love, right? So that's what I would guess is like the barrier to empathizing and reciprocity and things like that.
The other thing that I had read, sort of, I don't know that it's a competing theory of narcissism, but maybe just a second sort of etiology of it, and you're much more up to date on research given the work you're doing now than I am, but the other kind of origin story that I had read about was that it can form after an abandonment or after a highly critical parent, after a really actually painful relationship with a caregiver, where the child is enormously devalued in a way that is impossible to live in, impossible to kind of to contend with. And so there's an immense amount of shame that is internalized, and then the narcissism is kind of like a barricade or a citadel that's built up around, where then criticism is taken as an attack on that kind of soft inner, I shouldn't say soft, but vulnerable inner shame. So criticism is immensely painful because it kind of brings up those feelings of shame. It sort of turns the citadel into a mirage, shows that it's unstable and inaccurate.
It's a defensive, it's a coping mechanism. I think you're right that what the pain of narcissists might feel in love relationships or in love and in intimacy in general is this underlying sense from their previous experiences that they're not lovable or have not been loved for the whole person they are. Mm-hmm. They're loved or gotten admiration from people for their good qualities, but that's not the same as like, I'm capable of being loved just for being me. A lot of that comes from when parents are emotionally neglectful, or, abandoning in some way. And the kid is only like, I'm trying to get love. So it's like a pain of like feeling unlovable and only doing the things and only presenting the things that they think are actually going to get love and approval.
I mean, it makes sense. I think a lot of us who have had healthy parents, we are brought up with some concept of unconditional love. And if you don't have unconditional love, then what do you do to get love? You present your best self, or you present your most dazzling self.
Yeah, I see it as, narcissism in relationships is like conditional love. I'm only loved if I'm perfect, right? How sad is that?
Yeah.
At least we can extend compassion to them, because of that. That's a really hard way to live, and it's very exhausting. You have to put up, you have to be on, you have to present yourself in a certain way in order to feel love. And that's really sad.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's also sad for the person dating them.
Yep.
What?
Go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I dated someone when I was 21 to 24 and a half who was just, if you're going to date a narcissist, maybe try dating this one, because at least it was, when it wasn't incredibly painful and chaotic and terrible, it was a whole lot of fun. He was handsome, he was wealthy, he was dazzling, he was so much fun. He would stay up until 5 a.m. with me in New York when he was in his 40s, which I can't even imagine doing now that I'm not even 30. He was very, he was just so like in your face, and his presence was always felt. And as a young woman, that was very attractive, even though everyone around me was saying, oh my God, what a douchebag. Like, he's such a show off. He's so kind of cloying and irritating and desperate for attention and clearly insecure and all these things. For me, it was, I loved the power imbalance. I loved feeling swept up and taken away by him and feeling very powerful in this powerful city at a time when I wasn't very powerful at all. So all of that was so attractive. But the dark side of it was, if there was any hint of me criticizing him, it was World War III. I would be dumped in the middle of the street at 4 a.m. He would rant and rave at me. He would insult. He always told me that honesty was the most important quality, but he always kept our relationship incredibly ambiguous. So later, when he accused me of cheating during a time when he had explicitly stated that our relationship was not exclusive, that somehow justified him in calling me a whore and telling me to go to hell and telling me what a horrible person I was, etc., etc. Then, I come to find out later that he had a girlfriend the whole time who didn't know about me, and then there were other women, and just total insanity. Endless gaslighting. So now, it's interesting. Like, I don't have a fear of being cheated on. I have a really big fear of being manipulated and controlled, because that's how it felt coming out of that relationship. It was, I think this might be a Taylor Swift lyric actually, but it was a chessboard where the pieces and the rules were always moving. There was no right move I could ever make. He always held the power. He always changed the rules. And he always had this ability to just make me feel, he wielded his age over me, telling me I didn't have relationship experience and I was young, and so therefore he was right and I was wrong. But yeah, this happened once we were on vacation, and I wouldn't make out with him in the middle of a catamaran where there were children around, and that was Armageddon. Like, just the smallest little insults to his ego would just end up in like just iciness or a just total barrage of expletives and abuse.
That's
so
hard. That
was a fun time.
Yeah, I hear of the elements of the problem with narcissism in that story, right? There's the grandiosity, right? And the grandiosity can look like being super fun, right? Mm-hmm. It's like the dazzling qualities, being super fun, being, funny, charming. But then your experience sounds a lot like the experience of someone who's like a loved one of a narcissist. They feel like they aren't being committed to a lot, mm-hmm. right? There's a form of exploitation, which in the relationship could look different things. Basically, it seems to look like you as the partner put in more than you get back from the narcissist, mm-hmm. right? So like the level of commitment that you're giving, and he was cheating, right? Or the level of attention, probably like your need to admire him all the time or not criticize him. And in some relationships, the exploitation could look like, I don't know about yours, but that the partner has to do like the dirty work or hard things that the narcissist doesn't want to do, like paying the bills or, I don't know, like having certain kind of conversations or taking care of the kids or, you know, doing the hard work of day-to-day life. And that is also a form of exploitation, right? So that the narcissist doesn't feel like they had to reciprocate in the same way.
Yeah. I mean, I can say what was so addictive about this relationship was that it kept me in the idealization phase at all times because there was never an opportunity to move past it. If things started getting real, we had a fight and broke up. He made it feel like all the colors in the world were brighter and everything, the volume was turned up, even with the chaos. And I'm left a little bit with that legacy. It makes it hard then to appreciate softer relationships. But yeah, I mean, that need to be constantly in the ideals phase. Nothing ever becomes comfortable. Nothing ever becomes committed and normal. He wasn't the type where he wasn't doing the dirty work because we never got there. So I don't know as much about that. And also because he paid for everything by nature of being very wealthy and older. And I think he enjoyed that role because he could throw money at things and he would be respected for that. But not every narcissist is rich.
Right. And it just seems like in a normal relationship, right, the partners have to work together on the nitty gritty, like how to pay bills, how to pick up the kids. And narcissists tend to not want to sacrifice too much. Like that's part of the entitlement. They're like, I'm so special. I don't have to do things I don't want to do. And so that usually leaves the partner to do a lot of the stuff. Right. And it varies by couple, right? If the partner is okay, you know, spending the money, that's not the place of the exploitation. It could be like, I don't like to take care of the kids. You know, I don't want to have to do that. I just want to be a fun dad or mom and then, you know, walk away and let the partner take care of all the other stuff. So,
yeah, I mean, how would you say, because that's something I don't have experience with, but how would you say it works? Like, how do they get someone who doesn't want to be paying all the bills to pay all the bills? Like, I don't know if you have personal experience with this or anything, but.
Yeah, I think in clinical work, I'm seeing more that narcissists tend to date other narcissists. And you know, one might be self-sacrificing in the way that they tend to be overgiving. And, that's how they want that connection through how much they give. And so they overgive and don't set their own boundaries. And then the other kind of narcissist will take advantage of that. Seriously, like that's what I'm seeing clinically. Yeah, and I think they're just not, and I think that people who might be in a relationship with narcissists might think, oh, it's me. I'm deficient. I'm not good enough. I'm not doing enough. If they loved me, they would commit more. And then it's really about, you know, whether the narcissist will, if that's their pattern, and it doesn't matter who it is, but it's all throughout their lives and any kind of romantic partners. And it's like, yeah, so I think many people have struggled with this in all different kinds of relationships, and the people who tend to stay in it, you know, they benefit a lot from the narcissist's good qualities. Like they're super fun, maybe they're wealthy, maybe they're have some kind of like dazzling aspect about them that's super valuable to that partner, and the partner's willing to like put up with the rest of the stuff until they get fed up with it or they feel, you know, like it's not reciprocal.
Yeah. I was just, we won't get into this now, but I was just remembering an argument I heard behind me on an airplane once after my ex and I had broken up. And it was just like, I was like, the guy is so clearly a narcissist and the woman is so clearly falling into this pattern. It was just this, I remember writing out all the steps on my phone of the gaslighting experience where he just held his place. He's like, you're in the wrong, even though he had done something clearly insane. And I just watched her energy get more and more and more built up. When she's railing against him, you can tell she just wants to beat the shit out of him, but he's just made her feel like her reality was not her reality and was just wounded and steadfast. And then you just see her totally reverse her position. She started apologizing, and then the relief washes over her when he gives her just a crumb of intimacy and love again. So, I mean, it was just...
Hard. Yeah.
It was amazing to watch.
I think another dynamic with narcissists that people, at least I wasn't aware of until I started doing more clinical work with narcissists, that it could also, people don't realize that it might be with a person who has vulnerable narcissism, because the person's not haughty or arrogant. They're actually more like hiding themselves in many ways. They're more shame-based. They're more like low self-esteem. Like they might be on more the vulnerable side in that sense, where you could kind of tell because it's still about ego. It's still like they are so wrapped up in the fact that they're not an ideal, that they just feel horrible about themselves. And to the point where like the partner has to compensate. Like I've seen a couple of patients who there's a vulnerable narcissist and then the other partner is like paying for everything because the vulnerable narcissist feels like incompetent and can't possibly take the steps they need to, be like a fully reciprocal partner. So it could look like that. It's not just the arrogant asshole, but it's also this like shame-based one that's more vulnerable.
Yeah, I guess what I find difficult to parse out, though, is like what is NPD or what is narcissism versus what is insecurity or what is an avoidant attachment style, or, because there is such... Do you know who Dr. Ramani is? She's a YouTuber who talks a lot about narcissism. And I feel like one of the things she does is she feeds a lot of frenzy into, oh my God, I'm dating a narcissist. Or, oh yes, like anything that kind of pisses you off and makes you mad that you've been resenting in your relationship. Now you can be like, oh, that's because they're a narcissist. That's because there's something wrong with them. And I don't know quite how to avoid that trap because sometimes you are, and sometimes it does come in these more kind of covert forms. But it is a persistent pattern that is destructive in the relationship or in their lives. And it's not just one symptom or facet of behavior, because we have to remember that we all have forms of narcissism. And even envy, being envious of others or thinking that people are envious of you is a symptom of narcissism, and one that I think is incredibly human and ubiquitous in varying degrees. I think as we said, everyone has elements of this, and some people can be like this in just one relationship, and maybe in others they are different. But I think it's if the person is just so stuck on these idealizing dynamics, right? They only feel good if they're perfect. They only think their partner's good if they're perfect. And that's not just in one relationship, but all relationships and all these different areas of their life. That's more of like the pathological kind. That would be the difference. Just like with the rigidity and the how extreme it is, right? Yeah. Do you think that the lack of empathy or the exploitativeness is foundational to the disorder? It's interesting. It's an interesting question. I'm actually trying to think. Yeah. I actually think that the lack of empathy found in, and this is my hypothesis. I have to dig into research and do the research in order to figure this out. But I think that a lot of people with personality disorders, this is in the DSM now, but people with personality disorders often have empathy deficits. I think that's because parents and caregivers who don't empathize with their child really interfere with them developing into like a full person who can love and work and integrate into society. I think empathy is that important that if it's missing, that person will grow up to not know how to do it or why it's important. And they just, they didn't have a model for it. So I don't know if it's the core. It could be that that a parent not empathizing with the child is the core reason why the kid feels like I'm unlovable unless I'm perfect. And then therefore they just grow up to be to act in that way. But I don't know. This is a really good question. Yeah, because I'm just imagining what I see as a trait in a lot of people, which is idealizing, especially about love relationships and other things. But if they're not pairing that with mistreatment of perhaps their partner, then I I don't know what I would call that. Maybe I would just call that pathological idealizing, which, hello, my name is Jacqueline, and
So I think that these topics are super fascinating. I'm learning so much about them in my internship, and especially through Dr. Diana Diamond, who has been my supervisor for transference-focused psychotherapy, the psychotherapy that is a treatment for personality disorders, mostly borderline personality disorders, but also for narcissistic personality disorder. So she's the expert. She's been fantastic and telling me about like helping me understand what narcissism is and how it affects relationships. So she's the best person to talk about it. So we're going to have her on a podcast, and we're really appreciative she's just taking the time from her busy schedule to talk to us about this. Thank you so much. This is Dr. Diana Diamond. She is one of my supervisors on my internship, and she is just phenomenal. So she's an expert in narcissism. She's an emerita professor at City College in the program of clinical psychology, a senior fellow at Weill Cornell Personality Disorders Institute, faculty member of the New School of the New York Psychoanalytic Institute, and NYU postdoctoral program in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. So she is involved in some of the most prominent schools here in New York City. She's also just finished a book on the treatment of pathological narcissism, and in private practice in New York City and doing individual couples therapy and psychoanalysis. So she was the choice that we wanted to talk to about narcissism. She's such an expert and such a wonderful supervisor. So thank you, Diana, for coming on to this podcast to talk to us about narcissism.
Well, you're very welcome. I think that maybe we should start by talking about narcissism and love relations, because I think that's a major topic.
It's a great topic.
It's a huge topic. And of course, there's different variants of narcissism, gradations from normal narcissism, which is healthy self-assertion, healthy investment in the self, pleasure in one's achievements, and so on, and attributes, and a healthy sense that these are in sync with reality. When you get to pathological narcissism, we're really talking about investment in a pathological self-structure, not in a healthy sense of self. And I'm just going to describe that structure because I'm going to come back to it as we go on in our discussion. So we think about those with pathological narcissism as having a pathological grandiose self. And this is a specific configuration of self and object representations. The sense of self is comprised of an ideal self, that is what one wishes and hopes one could be. We all have a sense of an ideal self, an ideal other. Often as young children, we idealize our parents or other authority figures, loving people in our lives. And our ideal self actually comes out of our idealization of others. With those with narcissistic pathology, that ideal self becomes combined with the sense of the ideal other. And those two ideal structures overshadow the real self. So the individual's actual potential and capacities, in a sense, are so overshadowed by these ideal expectations and representations. Everything negative has to be ejected and projected, split off from the self, projected onto others, who are then also devalued and not seen realistically, because they're seen often in terms of a negative aspect of the self. Conversely, they can also be highly idealized. So others can be seen as an extension of these idealized representations of the self. So I think it's important to present what we call our object relations view of narcissistic pathology, because there's different versions of what pathological narcissism is. The second just overview point is that the pathological grandiose self exists at different levels of severity and distortion, depending on the level of organization of the individual. So high-functioning narcissistic people may have a pathological grandiose self where the ideal components do not completely overshadow the real self. So they can live in the world, be quite successful, have a realistic sense of what they can accomplish. But their relationships tend to be somewhat superficial, somewhat distorted, because they project, as I said, negative aspects of the self outward, and they feed on the adulation and admiration of others. And they often are talented enough and effective enough, socially dominant enough. So they've arranged their lives to get this kind of consistent admiration. So there's a kind of semblance of unity for higher functioning narcissistic individuals and stability of the pathological grandiose self. Then you have a borderline level. And in that situation, in the borderline level, the pathological grandiose self is comprised of highly, highly idealized views of self and others that really overshadows the real self. So the sense of self is much more severely distorted. It's unrealistic. Consequently, relationships are often very difficult to maintain. It's difficult for these people to work consistently because their grandiose expectations are never met by the reality of what they can actually do in the world. And so you have much more severe pathology. And then there's malignant narcissism, which we hear a lot about these days because it's applied to politicians right and left. I have to say, never did I think I would be picking up the New York Times and reading about malignant narcissism from Maureen Dowd and Frank Bruni. But in malignant narcissism, you have a pathological grandiose self that's infiltrated with aggression and paranoia and antisocial features. And for those individuals, they can also be somewhat high functioning, but they often have very severe distortions of reality because reality has to be made to conform to the pathological grandiose self. And they will actually act in an antisocial way in order to make reality conform to that. Okay, I think that's a quick overview.
Yeah, I would love to get a little bit, can you give us a picture of what that could look like? Because even as you're describing it, I think, oh, wow, how can we tell, between someone who has pathological narcissism and someone who has an ambition of what they want to become, or there's an ideal, oh, I want to be a professor one day. How do I know, what is this level? What does it look like when it's pathological narcissism, especially for people on the outside, watching these people or close to these people?
Okay. Well, I think the answer to that has to do with the level of functioning of the person. If the person is higher functioning and they have, very high ambitions and so on, that have some capacity for attainment, what they might do is organize their entire life and their sense of well-being and self around achieving those, grossly neglect their personal relationships or other aspects of their life, exploit people on their way to the top, sometimes cut corners, sometimes break rules, although when someone's higher functioning, they usually have some preserved ethical standards. So that's how that would show up in a chronic devaluation of others, exploitation of others, arranging their lives so they can get the admiration of others.
I feel like when I've interviewed some people, they actually do kind of have a realistic sense of where they stand in relations to others, and that comes across as arrogant, but I'm not sure that that's truly narcissistic. So I think maybe in popular culture, we conflate narcissists with people who are arrogant, and there's kind of I think a lot of people have an image of the narcissist as a 25 to 30-year-old guy who is on the upswing of his career and doesn't really treat women as well as he should and is often cheating. And I'm not sure if that qualifies or if that's an accurate representation.
Well, yeah. I think that there's certain things about the love relations of those who have narcissistic pathology, which we can get into in more depth in a minute. But I would say that when you have pathological narcissism, just to summarize, you
Mm.
have overinvestment, not in a real self, but in a pathological brand of self. These people tend to be also very highly critical of others and of themselves. So there's a certain amount of torture involved in pathological narcissism, and a turning of aggression against the self. Um, there's sometimes an avoidance of living in realities that don't correspond to the grandiose self. There's splitting off and projection of negative parts of the self onto others. Any aspect of the self that causes pain and anxiety, a sense of weakness or being defective, or a sense of being humiliated, that will often be ejected, projected onto others. There's often incorporation or introjection of aspects of others that are unique, admired, and evoke envy. So, in other words, these people have a tremendous amount of difficulty acknowledging the otherness of others, and particularly those they admire and then envy. They try to incorporate those others, subjugate them, or introject their qualities, make them their own. In therapy, this shows up as narcissistic patients, repeating back to the therapist their own observations or interpretations as though they came from the patient. And all of those things preclude a genuine, mature love relation, because others are loved not as separate and unique, but for their representation of imagined aspects or parts of the self, or, and this gets us into another area, intensely cathected, idealized internal objects that are felt to be part of the self. So that's a sort of fancy way of saying these individuals also tend to invest heavily in their own internal idealized images of others, and others usually fall short. So in terms of how that plays out in love relations, you could say that, these individuals are in perpetual search for the idealized figure. And they're very good at brief relationships. And there's actually been some social psychological research on this. They have, they can become infatuated readily. They can have very intense brief relationships, but of course, longer term commitment is much more difficult because the infatuation wears off. And they equate love with that limerence, with that dopamine high, and they're in constant search for it. I'm sure we all have patients like this who simply can't commit. If that's a transient developmental phase, that's quite different. But often I will see men who are in their 30s, mid 30s to say early 40s, and they suddenly realize they're really out of sync with their peer group, that their peer group, are getting married or partnering, developing families, investing more deeply in relationships, and they're still, going from relationship to relationship. They often have, a steady partner who's long suffering, who's waiting for them to commit. And they will have that person kind of waiting in the wings, but they'll devalue that person. And so sometimes they come not because they feel there's really something wrong with this, but they feel like other people may be thinking there's something wrong with them because they can't commit. They can't invest more deeply in relationships.
I was just gonna ask if there are usually observed differences between male and female narcissists. I remember reading some book that actually the psychologist for The Bachelor recommended to me. It was like it was like the Narcissist Handbook or something. It wasn't that, but it made very clear differences between male and female narcissists, and I wondered if that was actually accurate.
Generally, it's a form of pathology that is more frequent in men, but with gender roles changing, women being much more, driven, successful professionally, you also have this syndrome developing in women. I do think there are differences, however. It's something that hasn't really been studied, I think, as much as it should be. Um, I think that women tend to be more on the vulnerable side of narcissism. And we can talk about that in a minute. So there's really two presentations of narcissistic pathology. There's grandiose narcissism, in which the person is socially dominant, um, arrogant, exploitative, entitled, um, and manipulative. Uh, the vulnerable face of narcissism is somewhat different. With vulnerable narcissism, you have individuals who they show their grandiosity in different ways. They may be preoccupied with grandiose beliefs about the self, but they hide those because they're afraid to test them in reality. They may feel that they're special by virtue of their suffering. These are the patients who come to you and sort of tell you that, they've never been able to be helped, and they don't expect that, you will be able to really help them or help them change, but they need a place to vent. So there's a sense of being special in their suffering and clinging to that suffering. They can be self-sacrificing, chronically self-sacrificing in a kind of grandiose way, expecting people to valorize them for their self-sacrifice. They have very uneven self-esteem.
Awesome. Yeah. That was actually pretty in line with the book.
Yeah.
A lot of martyrdom.
And so what can you tell us a little bit more in terms of like the love relationships? What does it look like? What are the common experiences of people who have a loved one with pathological narcissism? What is it like for them in those relationships? What is their common struggles, things they might be suffering from but not realizing it's because of narcissism?
Usually in the beginning of the relationship or early in the relationship, constant idealization. And then the flip side of that, of course, as they get to know the person with the wear and tear of daily life and that initial, shimmering idealization, which is part of every love relation, serious love relation in the beginning, begins to diminish, there isn't the capacity to invest deeply in the person and to really feel a sense of love for their uniqueness, for seeing them realistically with all of their faults and good points. Because for many narcissists, idealization is the closest they can come to love. They're always looking for the perfect soulmate. So I have a patient right now who is in a relationship with someone he's been in a relationship for many years, on and off. And yet he won't finalize the commitment because he keeps thinking that this mythical, idealized woman is going to appear and somehow magically make him feel whole and complete, even though he knows it's a chimera. So sometimes idealization is the best these people can do. It's very difficult for them to adapt to the reality of the partner, separate from their own fantasies. And so the individual who's in a relationship with someone like this, doesn't feel seen or accepted for who they really are. And often has a lot of difficulty in expressing their needs to the partner, which is one of the things that's really important, that the spouse or the partner of the narcissistic individual becomes inured to being treated as a narcissistic extension, and probably have their own needs met to some extent through that. And so they don't ask for what they need.
Can you give us an example? Can you give us like a clinical example, what that could look like?
Well, at the most basic level, commitment, that they'll tolerate a partner who ambivalates for years and years. Another thing could be tolerance of chronic infidelity, feeling that, this is just something that they have to live with. And that this is the only way to keep their spouse. So they basically become less and less engaged in the relationship in terms of deeper intimacy, asking for what they need emotionally, sexually, and so on. And they can accept the role of just being, a trophy or, uh, being a domestic slave at the worst case scenario. They often, interestingly enough, intuit how brittle narcissistic individuals can be. Very, very brittle, um, easily punctured, easily humiliated. And you can see that even with seemingly impermeable, grandiose narcissists. If they feel criticized or they feel humiliated, they will ruminate and rage about it. They have a lot of difficulty with that because, of course, that ties into their own sense of vulnerability that's usually projected onto others. And I should say that I do have a dynamic view of narcissistic pathology. I think always, regardless of the initial presentation, whether it's vulnerable or grandiose, there's always a flip side. So with the grandiose narcissist, there's always an underbelly of vulnerability. And you can see that when somebody feels criticized or humiliated, the rage that ensues is way beyond what most people would experience. And conversely, those who have vulnerable narcissism have often secret pockets, hidden pockets of grandiosity. So what I was saying is that the person who's in a relationship with a narcissistic individual often is aware of their quite exquisite vulnerability and will not challenge them because either they don't want to incur the rage or they want to prop up the person's, self-organization. And so, and also they don't want to evoke shame. Those with narcissistic pathology are very prone to a deep sense of shame about their needs for attachment, about their vulnerabilities. And so individuals who are in long-term relationships with these people learn to work around their vulnerabilities and to prop them up. That's kind of the price of the relationship.
So is there any hope for narcissists?
And their loved ones. It sounds so hard. That sounds really hard. You constantly you're a domestic slave, devalued, not accepted for who you are, and also cheated on and have to prop that person up all the time. That sounds hard. What would you suggest? How would you, do you just manage this or can you treat it?
It's a long process. Treating those with pathological narcissism, the first stage is engagement. Often these people come to treatment because somebody in their life, a spouse, a partner, a parent, has basically given them an ultimatum. And it often comes as a shock. I've had people, come into treatment because their personal assistant of 20 years who organized their life and made their life possible just up and quit and said they couldn't take working with them anymore. And it was just a tremendous shock. So often people come to treatment at a moment of vulnerability. And one has to work very gingerly with that and, really work with the person on what are the costs and benefits of this grandiose self-experience and presentation, because there are always benefits. And that helps to define what the dominant representations are of self and significant others that are framing their behavior. So I would say getting the person to treatment is really important. And individuals who are with those with pathological narcissism have to do that by confronting the person about what their experience is like of being with them. Their feeling of being exploited, their feeling of being dominated, their feeling of being, most importantly, not recognized as a unique other and appreciated for that. So, and how difficult it is to live with someone who doesn't accept realistic limitations, either in the self or other people. And, who's, when confronted with any vulnerability, just experience the most searing shame, which then makes them turn on the other person. So I think it's really important for those who live with people with pathological narcissism to make these needs known and to make their experience of the other person known. And then to get the person into treatment. Either, often a segue into treatment is through couples work. And it's often the couples therapist who will then refer the person with pathological narcissism to individual treatment. So it can be a multi-stage process. Or it can go in the opposite direction too, that people get into individual treatment, but then it's clear that there are issues with the couple, patterns that are such long-standing. They really need couples work to deal with that.
So getting that person to treatment is ideal. What if, what can they do in their current relationship? Like how could they change maybe the interactions or set limits? Can they even, or is the main suggestion to get them to treatment? Well, or leave the relationship? Is that the only option, or is there a way to stay in the relationship and manage these problems?
I think, again, confronting the person on a daily basis about their lack of gratitude, about their exploitativeness, about their lack of empathy. There actually has been some very interesting social psychological research, which shows that if you put those with pathological narcissism in a laboratory situation in which you evoke empathy, that those with pathological narcissism who feel empathy momentarily, this will carry over and affect how they respond to questionnaires afterward. Now, I think that this is very, very interesting. It's not the kind of research that most long-term depth psychotherapists think about, but I would not rule out that at some point there may actually be apps for pathological narcissism that we could design in which people are put in a situation in which empathy is induced so that they can, I know it sounds kind of phantasmagoric, in which they can see their own lack of empathy reflected, learn to experience empathy, and some of these responses have to be learned. They have to be learned, and they're never going to be learned unless the partner stands up and confronts the person about what they see as lacking in that person. And I should say, just as we're wrapping up, that Freud originally talked about two different types of love in his essay on narcissism. There's the anaclitic love, type of love, where one, loves the person as an attachment figure that they need, seen as a separate person, or the narcissistic type of love, where one loves the other because of how they enhance the self. And in healthy love relations, you have those two strands intertwined so that the loving partner enhances the self, but also self-love is expanded by giving to a partner who's seen as a genuinely unique other who can contribute to that person's life. So, with those with narcissistic pathology, it's often the narcissistic type of love that's valorized. So they can't see others as separate from the self. And that leads them to regulatory deficits and maladaptive strategies to cope with any threat to their positive self-image. But some capacity for anaclitic love is a good prognostic sign, even if it's not in their most intimate relationships.
Thank you so much. This was a fantastic interview. You really rounded out, our understanding of pathological narcissism, not just this kind of stereotype, arrogant CEO, but how hard it could be for the loved ones and assistants and people around and also for the person with narcissism, this is actually a disorder. This is something that people struggle with. It's more common than we think. So I really, really appreciate you giving us your expert overview of this.
Okay, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, so Kibby, just on a last note, I was so grateful for Diana coming on and kind of telling us more about what narcissism is and the theories behind it. I know you've been learning a lot about treatment for NPD and for narcissism. Could you just kind of give us a rundown of what that looks like and what people should be looking for?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is there's not nearly enough. The last time I heard, there's not a lot of good clinical trials for treatment for narcissistic personality disorder on its own. However, we are adapting a lot of treatments for other kind of personality disorders for narcissism. So I think the main ones that all work for borderline personality disorder, which is dialectical behavior therapy, mentalization-based therapy, and transference-focused psychotherapy. All of those therapies are DBT is more a cognitive behavioral, but the others are more psychodynamic. So they were developed for borderline personality disorder, but they tend to work very well for people with narcissism because there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of overlap in problems. There's a lot of comorbidity, which means that people who have borderline personality disorder also have like a little bit of narcissism. So when people are looking for a treatment for NPD, look for those things. Look for anybody, a therapist or a treatment model that has some background in treating personality disorders, right? So that would be the first go-to. As a heads up, a lot of those treatments are very intensive. They take a long time, so it's not a lot of quick turnaround. And the person who has narcissistic personality disorder might not recognize they have it until like deep in their therapy. So it might even just take time to identify the problem and identify what is driving a lot of their problems with intimacy. So it takes a lot of patience. And I would say also in response to what Diana was saying about loved ones of people with NPD and pathological narcissism, to like confront the narcissist and just say like, here's the issue, and these are things in a way I feel taken advantage of or is not working, right? The kind of putting your foot down. I mean, look, I would say that listen to our setting boundaries episode kind of as a framework for how to say something like that. It could be really approached very compassionately, like, I know you love me and I love you. However, I really feel like we're not reciprocal or we're not equal in these ways. I feel like I'm giving this and I feel like you're not giving the same amount back. And I think this is a real problem, and it's making me feel really XYZ, feel really hurt, feel very lonely, feel very insecure. And in order for us to, really have a good relationship, I think that we should get treatment for this, either a couples therapy or, find a therapist for you. And if the person is not receptive, like if they say no or they argue back, I say that the setting boundaries also makes sense, where if you feel like you're giving to your narcissistic partner more than you're receiving, set limits and just be very clear about them. I'm not going to do this kind of work unless you do this, or I'm only going to do this much for you, and the rest you're going to have to take care of yourself. So sometimes like standing up doesn't have to be like getting them into treatment. It could just be like knowing your own limits and communicating them very clearly. Okay. And also, I mean, for loved ones of people with narcissism, like keep in mind that this is part of the disorder. It's not something that's deficient in you, or if only you did this more or you were better at this. Like sometimes people really are very hard on themselves, and they take upon themselves to like try to fix the problems in the relationship. But to know, I'm hoping that this discussion about what narcissistic personality disorders is can kind of shed some light on what's going on with them, mm-hmm. and why they might be like not committing as much, or exploiting you in certain ways, or not giving back in certain ways, or empathizing with you. And it's not you. It might be them.
Another thing that I would add is, if you are feeling like something's off in your relationship, talk to other people. Because what I was doing in my relationship was ignoring everybody's advice. It was so obvious what was going on to other people, and I wanted to believe that I was special. I wanted to believe that just because he fit every pattern of a narcissist, you know, that our relationship would beat the odds, and that life wasn't as cliche as everyone said it was. But honestly, if I had listened to other people, like, I could have gotten out sooner. Your friends will be able to recognize the signs, because it's very easy to get wrapped into the dazzle, and they can make you feel like nobody has ever made you feel before. But the people observing them don't feel that way. So it's very easy for them to see what's going on. So listen, talk, get advice. And the other thing is, the narcissist can make you feel like you don't have a grasp on what's normal or healthy, but your friends probably do. And so if your friends are telling you, like, look, this isn't normal, the way that he's treating you isn't normal, or she's treating you isn't normal, the way that you're expected to act in this relationship isn't normal, the amount of yourself that you are giving and not receiving isn't normal, that's really valuable information to get.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that not to forget that a huge part of the disorder is the hiding the real self, like hiding the flaws, hiding the ugly sides, hiding things that are not part of the idealized version of you. So that could happen in relationships too. I think partners of people in narcissism will kind of be complicit in hiding the fights, the downsides, the ugly parts, the parts that don't dazzle. And, you know, I think, as you're saying, as they talk to people, tell the whole story, you know, and tell the whole story to yourself, so you really see the full picture and not just, oh, they're amazing this way, but, you know.
Yeah, because it can be very shameful. It was very shameful for me to be the person that was sobbing at 4 a.m. on Broadway. You know, like, it's very shameful to go back to the same person who treated me like shit over and over and over again. So it can be very tempting to not talk to other people, but then you lose your grasp on what's normal. So it's okay. We've been there. Most people I know have had one of these relationships, so it's okay to talk about.
And this is such a big topic that is becoming more popular now, with never mind. I was about to say politics, but this is a really big topic. We love talking about narcissism and narcissistic personality disorder. It's a big part of our culture these days. So feel free to let us know if there's any other aspects of it you're curious about. We will put up Dr. Diamond's information about her new book coming out about narcissism and treating narcissistic personality disorder, as well as she has done a lot of fantastic interviews and videos about this that are really accessible and really, really informative and interesting. So we'll put that on the website too. Just go to our website and the episodes page, and you can find it.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for listening again. Please rate, review, and subscribe if you enjoyed this episode or this podcast generally, and we will see you next week. By accessing this podcast, I acknowledge that the hosts of this podcast make no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of the information featured in this podcast. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only, and any reliance on the information provided in this podcast is done at your own risk. This podcast and any and all content or services available on or through this podcast are provided for general, non-commercial informational purposes only and do not constitute the practice of medical or any other professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment, and should not be considered or used as a substitute for the independent professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment of a duly licensed and qualified healthcare provider. In case of a medical emergency, you should immediately call 911. The hosts do not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in this podcast, and information from this podcast should not be referenced in any way to imply such approval or endorsement.